The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. This is how the birth of Jesus came about. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with child through the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, since he was a righteous man, yet unwilling to expose her to shame, decided to divorce her quietly. Such was his intention when, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife, into your home. For it is through the Holy Spirit that this child has been conceived in her. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke, he did as the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took his wife into his home. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus. The Lord himself will give you this sign. The virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. Emmanuel, God is with us. God is dwelling with us. God is dwelling within us. So what does that mean? In today's reading from Isaiah, the Lord himself speaks to Ahaz, king of Judah, promising to give him a sign of his power and his love. And Ahaz, although a pretty important figure in the history of Israel, doesn't listen. If you will indulge me, just a very short history lesson. If we remember, after the reigns of King David and King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel is divided into Judah in the south and Israel in the north. And they were constantly fighting each other. So along comes Ahaz, a direct descendant of King David, and he is to become the king in Jerusalem, which is in Judah in the south. However, at the same time, the Assyrians, which is a great kingdom to the east, they are gathering their forces to strike at the northern kingdom of Israel. And the kingdom of Israel is ruled by a man named Pekah. However, instead of preparing for the attack by the Assyrians, Pekah is making a deal with the king of Damascus, his next-door neighbor, to attack the southern kingdom of Judah. Well, they did fight with Ahaz, but they didn't defeat him. But what they did do was weaken themselves so much to the point that they were eventually conquered by the Assyrians. So their greed and their ambition gained them nothing. But I think what the point is that at this time, it was a time of great uncertainty and great danger. And I'm sure when Ahaz first learned of this coalition against him, his heart sank, most likely with fear. You see, Ahaz was not a good king. He didn't follow the religious laws of the people. He didn't listen to God. So I don't think he was expecting God to intervene. In fact, he had basically given up on God and was only looking out for his own ambitions. But God is God, and he doesn't give up. He doesn't give up on us, and he didn't give up on the house of David. In fact, in spite of how bad Ahaz is, God still sends the prophet Isaiah to him with a promise for the future. the future of Judah, and the house of David. But Ahaz, as many of us, he doesn't want to listen. So instead of relying on God for his strength, as Isaiah urges him to do, Ahaz allies himself with the Assyrian king. This is the same Assyrian king who conquers Israel in the north. So the northern kingdom falls, at which point Judah basically becomes a vassal state to the Assyrians. You see, Ahaz was ambitious and unfaithful, basically abandoning God for selfish reasons, temporal power, worldly relationships and alliances, and a false sense of security. We are told that he even adopts idolatry, one of the worst religious sins, to please the Assyrians. And how did this happen? Ahaz stops listening to God. And since Ahaz did not dwell with God, when God tried to dwell within him, Ahaz pretended not to hear. He ignored and rejected God. And even though Ahaz did not want to hear it, this prophecy is so important that the Lord uses Isaiah to tell it to him anyway. Some might call it a message of hope and perseverance, but I call it the message of hope. It is the promise of salvation for those who remain faithful to God, a promise of hope for the house of David. It is God's salvation of the world, foretold in the Old Testament, would come through its descendants. This is even though Ahaz, as head of the house of David at that time, he does not allow God to dwell within him because he will not open his heart and listen. Ahaz the king instead surrenders himself and his house, the house of David, to the subservience of the Assyrians for temporal power and wealth. So contrast this with Joseph, a simple carpenter, betrothed to a young woman who was found to be with child. You know, having a baby before formally married would have been a great sin and dangerous in those days. It would also have been a great insult to Joseph that could have led to shame and scandal for Mary and possibly her death. But Joseph desires none of this. He wants to quietly dismiss Mary so he can remain sinless before God. But God sends his angel to speak directly to Joseph and gives him the same prophecy given to Ahaz centuries earlier by Isaiah. The message of hope in the face again of uncertainty, danger, and even fear, and a call to serve God rather than Joseph's own ambitions. And rather than turn his heart away from God as Ahaz did, Joseph opens it to his will, just as Mary had at the Annunciation. And by doing so, Joseph, also of the house of David, reverses the sin of Ahaz and restores the Israelites to the path leading back to God. So where the mighty and proud had failed, Joseph and Mary, the simple carpenter and his bride, both prevailed in faith and in love. Through them, the salvation of the world would emerge, and God would truly be with us in both flesh and spirit. Emmanuel. So what do the stories of Ahaz and Joseph tell us today? You know, we all struggle with the choice of this world. Whether we orient ourselves to the temporal and the material, or whether we put the Lord first at the center of our hearts and our lives. Are we like Ahaz, putting ourselves on the path of destruction by paying homage to the material and temporal world, craving power or wealth to the extent that we stop listening and shut out God from our hearts and our lives. Remember, God calls us constantly, but we often stop listening, as Ahaz did. And eventually, as Ahaz did, we fail to even recognize his call. Joseph and Mary show us how we should orient ourselves to God. Ahaz turned his back on God for his own ambitions, even while the Lord called him directly. And Ahaz destroyed his house, the house of David. In today's gospel, Joseph listens and opens his heart to God and restores his house, the house of David, both in the sense of bringing Mary into his home and also of restoring the Davidic line. You know, in today's culture, most of us are told that we can do it all by ourselves. I'm in control. I can plan for the future. I trust my own abilities. But Advent, these past 4 weeks, and Christmas, through the stories of Ahaz and Joseph, present an alternate view. Trust first in God. Life may get in the way of our plans. Look at Joseph and what he may have planned for his future. But he chose to listen to God, and he not only survived, he flourished, unlike Ahaz. We can all have the strength to survive and thrive when we trust and listen to the one who is really in control. So when the Lord calls us, what will be our choice? Do we choose disobedience, ambition, wealth, selfishness, sin to reconcile us to the world? Or do we choose obedience, selflessness, and Christ to reconcile us to God? When he comes to dwell with us, within us, will we rejoice, or will we pretend that we do not hear?